Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Aristotle on nature. In particular, we're going to be discussing just two little fragments from much larger works by Aristotle, namely small segments from the Physics and De Anima. Our central goal for this week is to continue to build out our framework for understanding Aristotle, right? Last week we discussed the metaphysics, and so we are beginning to get our bearings on some of Aristotle's criticisms of the history of philosophy so far, namely that they did not specify the nature of causes. They sought knowledge, which is to know the cause of a thing, but they had not sufficiently reflectively considered the nature of cause itself. Now, in Aristotle's physics, we're going to get Aristotle's own account of the four different senses in which cause is meant. This definition of causes is really central to many different aspects of Aristotle's philosophy, and so we're going to see that concretely, I hope, through our examination of De Anima, which is going to concern the nature of the soul. And you'll see that much of the framework that he develops both in the metaphysics and the physics, he utilizes in De Anima to characterize the nature of the soul. So with that in mind, let's get into it. For this first column, we're discussing the physics, right? And here, Aristotle is concerned with nature, right? The same thing that the pre-Socratics, right, were also concerned with, right? And Aristotle conceives of nature in a very particular way. Artifacts do not have a nature, because a nature is an internal principle of organization. So, for example, if you go out into the Sandias or something like that, right? You're not going to see a whole bunch of chairs and tables and coffee makers and a whole bunch of artifacts, right? Why? Because the nature of artifacts is such that they are created by human beings. They don't just spontaneously emerge in nature, right? And so this is what Aristotle means when he says that artifacts don't have a nature, is that there's no internal principle that creates something like a bed or a computer monitor or a book or anything like that, right? Those are all artifacts. They all need to be created by human beings, right? Therefore, their principle of organization is external. It's in us, it's in the human beings, and not in the objects themselves, right? But to continue the same sort of metaphor or whatever, if you do go to the Sandias, somewhere where there's not a lot of other people, at least not normally, right? Maybe if you go enough out into the boonies or whatever, you will find trees and animals and wildlife and an ecosystem and ecology, right? And all of this predates human beings. Maybe not all of it, but the existence of an ecology like this predates the existence of human beings, and would continue to exist with even if there were no more human beings on the planet, right? Unlike tables and chairs and desks and computers, right? If the world had no human beings in them, there would be none of these artifacts. But it would still be filled with, the various forms of life that we think of, especially in biological terms. Aristotle is often called the Western tradition's first biologist. And he has a reasonable claim to this. He wrote books, for example, on the nature of animal parts, so comparative anatomy, zoology, all this kind of stuff were things that Aristotle was very interested in. You might recall from the last lecture, right? Aristotle's always pointing down in like the School of Athens painting and similar paintings like that, right? Which indicates his commitment to studying the real particulars of the world that we actually live in. So what is the point about this artifact stuff? Well, it's to point out that animals and also trees, for example, grass, all has principle. It's live, right? And in virtue of being alive, it's different than, just hunks, for example, of dead wood, right? There's a difference between a tree that will continue to grow and the hunks of wood that we might otherwise think that it's made out of, right? Or, you might be intending to turn those hunks of wood into particle board, right? But particle board, unlike a tree, does not continue to produce, right? It doesn't grow anymore once it's particle board, right? And that's because particle board does not have a nature, it doesn't have any internal principle of its self-organization, but an organism does, right? And in fact, you can see this as in many ways the source of our use of the word organism, right? It's something that spontaneously organizes itself, right? And therefore reproduces itself and populates, its environment and so on, right? And so Aristotle believed that things that have natures are substances, right? They're the really existing stuff of the world, right? And they have intrinsic properties. So there's something that it's like to be a tree, right? Trees have certain features, they have certain properties, right? And those properties are, in a certain sense, irrespective of what is in their environment, right? They're not relational properties, they're not properties that they have in virtue of being related to us, but they have intrinsic properties, properties that belong to them in order to be the thing that it is, right? An organism or a tree and so on. Right? And Aristotle tends to say that nature is spoken of in two ways, namely as form and as matter, right? And so examples that Aristotle gives, for example, right, you might think of like a sculpture, think of like a sculpture of Hercules, for example. I think Aristotle uses bronze as an example, right? There's a bronze statue of Hercules, and on the one hand, one way that we might talk about that statue, right, is we might just talk about, well, the stuff that it's made of, right, which in this case would be bronze. But on the other hand, you might say that that's not sufficient because we have not yet distinguished, say, the sculpture of Hercules in bronze from just like a pile of it that you found somewhere, right? A pile of bronze is not a statue of Hercules, right? And so in an important way, we can always sort of chop up whatever it is that we're discussing that has a nature as manifesting on the one hand a form, and on the other hand, a matter, right? And a form is not just a shape, right? A form is something like an emergent level of organization or something like that, right? So, obviously to be a statue, it has to be shaped in a certain way, right? But Aristotle will also say things like that seeing is the form of the eye, right? And what does he mean by this? Well, he means that an eye, to be an eye, what it does is it sees, right? And so the essence of an eye, the form of the eye, it isn't related to what kind of shape it is, right? There are many shapes of eyes in the animal world that are not exactly round like ours, right? So it's not really related to that, but its form instead defines, say, the purpose or something like that, like the reason why the matter is organized the way that it is, right? And in the case of eyes, that's in order to see. Hence, Aristotle later on in De Anima will make this distinction between the soul and the body, where the soul is the form, right? The soul is the form of a living thing, right? Hence, the soul always bears some relationship to the material body that it is the form of, right? And it's important to recognize that Aristotle is very much a pluralist, right? What can be described as matter is on one hand form, right? So like previously when we were talking about the statue, for example, we refer to its matter as being bronze. But in another way, you can think about bronze as being the form that certain I don't know, element of nature, matter, something like that takes up, right? And so distinguishing the form from the matter of a given thing is always perspectival for Aristotle, right? The sort of, you can maybe say, central dictum of Aristotle's philosophy is that being is said in many ways, right? So too nature is said in many ways. And Aristotle is less interested in trying to give like a single definitive account of what it is that we're talking about, so much as to make sense of the rational practices that we already have in making sense of the world, right? This is always how Aristotle thinks, of the role of the philosopher. The philosopher is not meant to confuse you or something like that, right? He tends to think of like Parmenides and Heraclitus as being very confusing in this way. They overturn your ordinary beliefs, say, for example, that motion is real, right? And so instead of vindicating your pre-philosophical point of view, they ask you, to the contrary, to completely revise it, right? Aristotle tends to think that any case where we're doing this is mistaken, right? The role of philosophy is not to overturn the knowledge that we already have, but to make sense of those things that we already know, to make sense of the reasoning practices that we already engage in. Hence, Aristotle is constantly asking, okay, let's look at the history of philosophy, or let's see what people have said, say, about the soul, for example, up to this point, right? And then by listing the various ways in which they've spoken about the soul or about cause or so on, then we can come to a definitive account by simply knowing all the different ways that people can come to speak about this thing. So, for example, because that was rather abstract, let's talk about cause, right? Aristotle thinks that there are 4 kinds of causes. There's what he calls a material cause, right? This corresponds to what he previously referred to as matter, right? And here, the central question is, what is it made of, right? In one, legitimate sense so that we can talk about the statue being caused is that the bronze statue of Hercules is caused by various properties of the bronze, right? The bronze allows itself to be shaped. The bronze, is able to support a certain amount of weight. The bronze is able to be manipulated, right? And in that way, the bronze is the cause of the statue, right? Certain salient features of the statue, if you want to know about them, well, that just is knowing the matter that it's made of, right? Hence, material cause, right? What is it made of? This is always the central question regarding the material cause. Aristotle also thought that the pre-Socratics, when they asked questions about the nature of the world, right, they were asking about the material stuff that everything is, in a certain sense, made of. Now, the second sense of cause, as you might imagine, right, is formal cause, right? It stems from the form. It stems from the essence of a thing, right? And this can be a little bit more difficult to understand, right? But think about, for example, the number 4, right? And we might ask a question like, why is 4 even? And when we ask about why 4 is even, what we're doing is we're asking about the essence of this number, right? Why does it have this necessary characteristic, namely being even, right? And so, of course, it would be absurd to talk about the material of mathematics, right? What is 2 made of? Or something like that. What is 4 made of? That's a kind of nonsense question, because the nature of mathematics, as Aristotle understands it, is a discipline that focuses on the form of mathematical or quantitative relationships. And so it intentionally abstracts from the matter, right? 2 could be 2 water bottles, it could be 2 desks, it could be 2 books, right? The whole point is that 2 as a form is indifferent to whatever, it is the form of, whatever it is that we're discussing 2 of, right? And so we can identify one way that things are caused or things are caused, right? Y is 4 even. Well, it belongs to the nature of 4 to be divisible by 2, right? And so in this case, we're not appealing to the material stuff that it's made of, right? But we're appealing to something like its essence, right? Um, the fundamental properties of it being the way that it is. So you might be wondering, okay, well, why are there 4 types of causes, but nature is only spoken of 2 ways, right? Well, with nature, we're thinking about only intrinsic properties, right? So we're thinking about, things that belong to the essence of the thing itself, right? The Hercules and the bronze, right? That's one of its intrinsic properties is that it's made of bronze, right? The number 4, one of its intrinsic properties is that it's divisible by 2, right? But in the case of efficient causes, here we start thinking about relations. And in particular, Aristotle is concerned with motion. So motion is something that is obviously not an intrinsic property, right? So like, for example, pen fell down, right? Its falling is not one of its intrinsic properties or something like that, right? It entered into motion, namely because I removed the support, right? Hence gravitation pulled it down, right? And so efficient cause, it'd be like, what is the source of this motion, right? In the paradigm case, think about like billiards, for example, right? It doesn't belong to the nature of the 8-ball to go into the distant corner pocket or anything like that, right? But instead, you have to externally impart skillfully a certain kind of motion into the 8-ball in order to, produce the right motion such that it will sink into the back corner pocket, right? Hence, efficient cause is sort of the way that we very often will talk about cause. Why did you fall over? Well, it hit me, right? Maybe your dog or a ball or something like that, right? It hit me. In that case, you're not really concerned with the material of the thing that hit you, right? You're interested in how it impacted and therefore imparted motion. And you're also not asking about the essence of the thing, because it's not the essence of anything to move in one direction rather than another, right? And so efficient cause always deals with relational properties, specifically the relation of things in space and time. Finally, the last sense that we talk about cause, right, is teleological cause, right, which answers the question, what is the purpose of this, right? So, for example, you're in this class, right? Why are you into this class? You might say, well, I'm in this class, to get a good grade and to continue my schooling and, all of these other reasons, right? And so then we could think about the desire, for your continued education, right, as being the cause for why it is that you're in this class, right? And obviously that's not anything material about you or the class. It's not anything formal about you or the class, right? And it's also not just a question of like, you got bumped into here, right, by your telos, your purpose, right, your desire to receive an education, right? To the contrary, when you desire to get an education and you see this as a stepping stone on the way to doing that, right, then you think about the education as being the purpose, right, the overall rational reason for the way that things are. Now, this framework will be exactly the framework that Aristotle uses in De Anima. Now, De Anima is often translated as on the soul, right? So the same as the Phaedo, for example, right? And here, one of the principal claims, unfortunately, you didn't get to read all of it, or even the part where he talks about human beings. He's mostly talking about plants and animals here. But Aristotle says that the soul is the form of a living thing, right? and that therefore the soul is different from but related to a physical body. One problem that you might have had with Plato, right, a problem that a lot of people have with Plato, is that for Plato, the soul is robustly non-material. This is why Socrates didn't care, right, that he was going to die, because he believed in one way or another that his soul would live on independently of his body, right? And this is, kind of standard theological belief. Aristotle says, to the contrary, that the soul is something like the life of a thing, right? It's the form of a living thing. So when you're alive, you have some standpoint on being alive, and that thing is like your soul, right? And so Aristotle didn't think of the soul as being independent of the body, or the soul as lasting longer than the body or anything like that. But instead, the soul is always indexed and related to a physical body. Of course, here Aristotle is a biologist. We have no cases where we can observe a soul without a body, right? Hence, he concludes the soul, it must be different from the body because it does different things than the body does, right? So, for example, I desire things, but my physical body, right, doesn't desire things. My physical body can persist after my death, right? We call that a corpse, right? And in that case, it no longer is ensouled. It no longer has the kind of organizational unity that it once had. Aristotle thinks, for example, that if you amputate a hand, for example, it's no longer part of your body and it's just there, right? Aristotle would say that is not a hand, right? That's maybe like a corpse. That's a part of a corpse. That's, a dead hand or something like that. He wouldn't really deserve the name hand. Why? Because to be a hand is part of being a body, right? It's part of having a sort of organizational unity such that it can perform certain kinds of functions relative to the rest of your body, right? Hence, Aristotle thinks that, the soul, the word psyche, where we get psychology from, right, is basically just what it is to be alive. Therefore, Aristotle quite naturally thought that both plants and animals were alive, and that therefore they had souls, right? Why do they have souls? Well, because they have natures. They have intrinsic properties. They have forms of organization that are internal to them, right? They're not just like lifeless stuff that gets pushed and pulled around at whim, right? Like a box of rocks or something like that, right? No, you can tell that plants, for example, have some sort of internal unity to their soul. Why? Because it continues to grow, right? A pile of rocks, for example, is exhaustively defined by being just that set of rocks, right? But a plant, because it can grow, it's always something a little bit more than its physical parts, right? It's always something a little bit more than its body as it exists right now, right? Because it has the potential to grow into something further. So plants, Aristotle observes, are nutritive, right? They grow towards the sun. Things can be better or worse for them, right? And consequently, they grow, right? It's not like they have some set number of parts, right? A physical body, a matter that remains completely unchanged or anything like that. But instead, they are something like a form that supervenes over a body, or a form that takes over a body, we could say, right? That organizes a body. And so too, animals have both of the characteristics of plants, but they have the additional characteristics of both self-motion and perception. Of course, you know, Aristotle didn't observe all plants, so you might say, like, for example, that a Venus flytrap, right, has some degree of self-motion, right? But certainly not to the extent that ordinary animals have, right? Moreover, plants don't typically have things like eyes or ears or tactile sense, right? Or at least Aristotle certainly didn't think so. But animals all share these features in common with us, right? Hence, Aristotle thinks that the animal soul is, in a way, a higher organizational unity than a plant soul, right? In addition to having the powers that plant has, right, the animal has the additional powers of self-locomotion and perception. This then finally leads to Aristotle's account of human beings. And we are defined by Aristotle as being rational animals, right? So over and above, the tendency, to satisfy our desires, for example, or to be, he calls it spirited, right? We also have the ability over and above that to reason, and that is an essential dimension of how Aristotle thinks of the human soul. And it's precisely because we reason with one another that we enter into political communities. You might also hear people say that Aristotle defined human beings as a political animal, zoon politikon, right? And this is true, right? But our political natures, in a way, simply stem from our rational natures, right? It's because we're rational that we can organize ourselves into communal environments like a polis. So you can see that, even though we're human, right, we're still nonetheless an animal. We still nonetheless have the needs, the characteristics, etc., that animals have. We simply have these additional capacities on top of the capacities the animals have to organize our perception in motion rationally, right? Now, finally, just something really quick to end on, right? This schema, it corresponds exactly to Plato's schema in the Republic for the different classes, right? So Plato in the Republic mostly described three different classes corresponding to three different parts of our souls, right? There's the nutritive part of our soul where we just want pleasure for pleasure's sake, right? And in this, we share this feature in common with animals who also, pursue pleasure, right? They pursue their desire, they pursue nutrition, right? We even have this in common with plants, right? Then Plato says, over and above, the sort of merchant class merely seeking to satisfy their hedonistic desires, there's this spirited class who are interested in the opinions and perceptions of other people, right? So you start to get these qualities of animal life, namely being self-moving, perceiving the world in a certain way, and so on, right? But it's still essentially sub-rational. And then finally, on Plato's account, you get the guardian classes, who are the genuine philosophers, and these are the people that are actually rational, right? Hence, Aristotle's consideration of these three different forms of the soul correspond exactly to three different forms of the soul in the Republic. Unfortunately, we didn't get to read that a whole lot together. Only, books 1, 2, 6, and 7. But nonetheless, you'll have to kind of take it on my word, I guess, that correspondence is there. I hope that you found this video interesting. Next week, we're going to be discussing Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I look very much forward to hearing what you all think. Goodbye.